The November wind cut through downtown Philadelphia like a blade, rattling the windows of the Philadelphia Inquirer newsroom. Marcus Rivera pulled his jacket tighter as he walked through the maze of desks, clutching a steaming cup of coffee that had already gone cold. At 32, he'd built a reputation as one of Pennsylvania's most tenacious investigative journalists, but the story waiting on his editor's desk would test every skill he'd developed over the past decade. "Marcus, sit down, Editor-in-Chief," Sarah Chun said without looking up from her computer. Her office walls were covered with framed front pages documenting the newspaper's most important stories over the past 20 years. "I've got something that's going to consume your life for the next few months." Marcus settled into the worn leather chair across from her desk. Another corruption scandal? Political cover-up? Sarah finally looked at him, her expression unusually grave. 134 people, Marcus. Gone without a trace over the past 10 years. All connected to one place. She slid a thick manila folder across the desk. The label read, St. Bartholomew Seminary, Missing Persons Investigation. The oldest seminary in Pennsylvania, Marcus sighed, recognizing the name. "I've driven past it dozens of times heading to Lancaster County. Beautiful Gothic architecture, sits on about 200 acres near Ephrata. Beautiful and deadly, apparently." Sarah leaned back in her chair. "The state police opened a preliminary investigation 6 months ago, but they're hitting walls. The seminary claims these people left voluntarily, transferred to other institutions, or simply decided religious life wasn't for them. Problem is, none of them ever contacted their families again." Marcus opened the folder and immediately felt his stomach tighten. The first page contained dozens of small photographs, men ranging in age from 18 to 65, all with the same hopeful expression that suggested they'd found their calling. "These are just from the past 3 years," Sarah continued. "Seminary students, visiting priests, even maintenance staff. They arrive at St. Bartholomew's, and within months, they vanish. The pattern is consistent. They become increasingly isolated. From outside contact, stop communicating with family, and then one day, they're simply gone." Marcus flipped through missing person reports, each one telling a similar story. "What does the seminary say?" "Father Augustine Blackwood, the seminary's director for the past 15 years, claims it's perfectly normal. Says religious life requires sacrifice and dedication that not everyone can handle. He provides transfer documentation for some, resignation letters for others. Everything appears legitimate on the surface. But you don't believe it." Sarah stood and walked to her window, gazing out at the city below. "My nephew Kevin enrolled there 2 years ago. Brilliant kid, full scholarship to Penn State, but chose seminary instead. Said he felt called to serve God." Her voice cracked slightly. "He stopped returning my sister's calls after 6 months. When she visited, they told her he'd transferred to a monastery in Montana. But Kevin was terrified of flying, Marcus. He wouldn't even drive to New York City because he got panic attacks. Montana might as well have been Mars." Marcus studied a photograph of a young man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Kevin Chun, age 19. "What do you want me to do? Go undercover?" "The seminary accepts older candidates who feel called to religious life later in their careers. Your background in theology from college, your Spanish fluency for their Hispanic outreach program, it's perfect cover." The idea of infiltrating a religious institution made Marcus uncomfortable, but the evidence was undeniable. "How long do I have?" "As long as it takes." "But Marcus ... Sarah turned back to him, her expression deadly serious. "If even half of what we suspect is true, you'll be walking into something far more dangerous than political corruption or corporate fraud. These people aren't just hiding financial irregularities. They're making human beings disappear." Marcus closed the folder and met her gaze. "When do I start?" "Next Monday. I've already submitted your application under the name Miguel Santos. Your cover story is that you're a former social worker from Newark who lost his wife in a car accident and felt called to dedicate your life to God. The trauma explains any inconsistencies in your behavior or questions about your past. As Marcus walked back to his desk, the weight of 134 missing lives pressed down on him. Outside, the Philadelphia skyline stretched toward the horizon, but his mind was already racing ahead to the rolling hills of Lancaster County, where Pennsylvania's oldest seminary held secrets that had consumed more than 100 lives. He opened his laptop and began researching everything he could find about St. Bartholomew Seminary, starting with its founding in 1847 by Irish immigrants seeking to establish a religious education center in the New World. What he discovered in those first few hours of research would haunt him for months to come. The taxi dropped Marcus off at the imposing iron gates of St. Bartholomew Seminary, just as the morning fog began lifting from the Pennsylvania countryside. The Gothic spires pierced the gray November sky like accusing fingers, and the ancient stone walls seemed to absorb what little sunlight managed to break through the clouds. "This is it, Miguel," he whispered to himself, testing his cover identity one final time. The transformation had taken weeks, growing out his hair, adopting different mannerisms, even changing his posture to reflect the humility expected of someone seeking religious life. Father Augustine Blackwood met him at the entrance, a tall man in his early 60s with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes that seemed to evaluate Marcus's soul. "Welcome to St. Bartholomew's, Miguel. I trust your journey from Newark wasn't too difficult?" "No, Father. I'm grateful for this opportunity," Marcus replied, adopting the slightly deferential tone he'd practiced. "After losing Maria, I've felt God calling me to something greater than myself. Grief can be a powerful catalyst for spiritual awakening," Blackwood said, leading him through corridors lined with portraits of former seminary directors. "Our Lord works in mysterious ways, transforming our deepest pain into purpose." The seminary's interior felt like stepping back in time. Stone floors worn smooth by decades of footsteps, stained glass windows casting colored shadows, and the persistent smell of incense mixed with old wood and candle wax. Marcus counted approximately 30 seminarians during their tour, all moving with the same measured pace and keeping their eyes downcast when passing senior faculty. "Our daily schedule is quite structured," Blackwood explained as they walked. "Matins at 5 a.m., followed by meditation, breakfast, morning classes, afternoon work assignments, vespers, dinner, evening study, and compline at 9 p.m. Lights out at 10 p.m. sharp." Marcus's room was spartanly furnished, a narrow bed, wooden desk, crucifix on the wall, and a small window overlooking the seminary's vast gardens. "No television, radio, or internet access in individual rooms," Blackwood noted. "We find such distractions hinder spiritual development. There is a computer lab available for necessary communication with family, though we encourage limiting outside contact during the formation period." "How long does formation typically last?" Marcus asked. "That depends entirely on the individual's progress and commitment. Some men discover their calling within months, others require years of discernment. We never rush the process. God's timeline isn't man's timeline." That evening at dinner, Marcus sat with 5 other newer seminarians in the refectory, a cavernous hall where conversation was limited to whispers. The food was simple but adequate: vegetable soup, bread, and water. He noticed several empty places at the long wooden tables. "Brother Timothy," Marcus ventured to a thin young man beside him, "how long have you been here?" 8 months, Timothy replied quietly, glancing nervously toward the faculty table. "Brother Paul was here before me, but he transferred last month. Montana, I think." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "Montana? That's quite far. Did he want to go?" Timothy's expression became guarded. "We don't question the assignments we receive. Father Blackwood knows what's best for our spiritual development." After dinner, Marcus explored the seminary grounds during the designated recreation period. The building was massive, 4 stories of dormitories, classrooms, a library, chapel, and administrative offices. But what struck him most was what he didn't see: cars in the parking area beyond faculty vehicles, phones in common areas, or any connection to the outside world beyond the controlled computer lab. In the chapel that night, he knelt among the other seminarians for Compline, the final prayer service of the day. The ancient Latin words echoed off stone walls while candlelight flickered across carved saints who seemed to watch with knowing eyes. As the service concluded and the seminarians filed out in silence, Marcus noticed Brother Timothy lagging behind. You all right?" Marcus whispered when they were alone. Timothy looked around nervously before leaning closer. "Brother Miguel, can I trust you?" "Of course. Something's not right here. The men who leave, they don't really leave. At least not the way Father Blackwood says they do." Marcus felt adrenaline surge through his system, but kept his voice calm. "What do you mean?" "Brother Paul, the one I mentioned at dinner? 2 days before he supposedly transferred, I saw him being taken to the basement level. He looked different, scared. I never saw him again after that. Maybe he was just nervous about the transfer." Timothy shook his head. "Brother Miguel, there is no transfer to Montana. I checked the computer lab when Brother Paul supposedly left. There's no record of any monastery in Montana accepting transfers from St. Bartholomew's. In fact, when I searched for information about former seminarians, I couldn't find any evidence that most of them ever existed after leaving here." The chapel suddenly felt colder, and Marcus noticed the shadows seemed deeper around the altar. "What are you saying, Timothy?" "I'm saying that men come to St. Bartholomew seeking God, but they never leave to find him anywhere else. And I'm starting to think that's not by choice." As they walked back to their dormitory in silence, Marcus realized he'd stumbled onto something far more sinister than simple institutional mismanagement. The missing weren't leaving St. Bartholomew Seminary. They were disappearing within its walls, and somehow the outside world was being convinced they'd gone elsewhere willingly. That night, lying in his narrow bed listening to the wind howl across the Pennsylvania countryside, Marcus began planning his real investigation. 3 weeks into his undercover assignment, Marcus had established himself as Miguel Santos, the grieving widower seeking solace in religious life. His days followed the rigid seminary schedule, but his nights were spent carefully documenting everything he observed. The pattern Timothy had described was becoming terrifyingly clear. "Brother Miguel, could you assist me with cataloging in the library?" Sister Catherine asked after morning prayers. She was one of 3 nuns who handled administrative duties, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, who seemed genuinely committed to her faith. The library occupied most of the seminary's 3rd floor, containing thousands of theological texts dating back centuries. As they worked in comfortable silence, Marcus decided to probe carefully. "Sister, I've noticed some of my fellow seminarians mentioning transfers to other institutions. Is that common?" Sister Catherine's hands paused over the card catalog. "Father Blackwood handles all personnel decisions. But yes, some men discover their calling lies elsewhere. Do you keep in touch with them? It would be encouraging to hear about their continued service." Her expression became troubled. We're discouraged from maintaining outside correspondence once someone leaves. Father Blackwood believes it can interfere with their new commitments." Marcus sensed her discomfort and pressed gently. "Of course that makes sense. Though I imagine you must worry about them sometimes." Sister Catherine glanced toward the door, then leaned closer. "Brother Miguel, I've been here for 12 years. In that time, I've seen many good men come and go. Some genuinely weren't suited for religious life, but others ... She trailed off, shaking her head. "Others what, sister?" "Others were deeply committed, showed real spiritual growth, and then suddenly they were gone. No goodbye, no explanation beyond the official transfer paperwork. It's not natural for someone to leave without saying farewell to people they've lived and prayed with for months or years. That afternoon, Marcus volunteered for maintenance duty, hoping to gain access to areas of the seminary normally off-limits to seminarians. Brother Francis, an elderly monk who supervised building maintenance, assigned him to replace light bulbs in the basement storage areas. The basement was a labyrinth of stone corridors and heavy wooden doors. Most contained cleaning supplies, old furniture, and archived records. But as Marcus worked his way deeper into the building's foundations, he discovered sections that didn't appear on any floor plan he'd seen. "Brother Francis," he called out when the old monk checked on his progress, "what's behind these locked doors down the far corridor?" Brother Francis's face went pale. "Those are restricted areas. Private meditation chambers for senior faculty. You shouldn't go down there, Brother Miguel. Father Blackwood is very particular about access." But that night, Marcus returned to the basement with a flashlight and lock-picking tools he'd hidden in his room. The first locked door opened to reveal a small chamber with stone walls and no windows. It contained only a wooden chair and metal restraints mounted to the wall. Dark stains on the floor looked suspiciously like dried blood. The second chamber was larger and contained what appeared to be medical equipment minus 4 stands, syringes, and several bottles of prescription medications. Marcus photographed the drug labels with a tiny camera he'd concealed in his prayer book. Sedatives, anti-anxiety medications, and something called Halcyon that he didn't recognize. The third door led to an office filled with filing cabinets. Marcus's hands trembled as he opened the first drawer and found detailed psychological profiles of dozens of seminarians and visiting clergy, including himself. His file contained information that should have been impossible to obtain: his real name, his job at the Philadelphia Inquirer, even details about his investigation. "My God," he whispered, realizing his cover had been blown from the beginning. A noise in the corridor froze his blood. Footsteps were approaching, and he could hear Father Blackwood's distinctive voice speaking to someone. "The journalist has been useful for understanding how deep the outside investigation goes," Blackwood was saying. "But he's becoming too curious about the basement. It's time to move him to the next phase." Marcus quickly closed the filing cabinet and searched desperately for another exit. At the far end of the office, he found a narrow passage that led to a different section of the basement. He crawled through just as the office door opened behind him. The passage emerged into a larger chamber that made Marcus's stomach lurch. Hospital gurneys lined the walls, each equipped with leather restraints. Medical monitoring equipment hummed quietly in the corners. But most horrifying were the dozens of personal effects carefully organized on metal shelves: wedding rings, family photographs, wallets, and driver's licenses. Marcus recognized several faces from the missing persons file Sarah had shown him. Kevin Chun's student ID was pinned to a board, along with those of 30 other men. Below each photo was an index card with dates and notations in Blackwood's handwriting. Initial resistance overcome, Day 12. Full compliance achieved, Day 31. Final processing, Day 45. A metal door at the far end of the chamber bore a sign: Processing Room, Authorized Personnel Only. Marcus approached it with growing dread, knowing he was about to discover the truth behind 134 disappearances. The door was unlocked. Inside, he found an industrial-sized furnace and several large metal containers filled with ash. The smell was unmistakable and overwhelming. Marcus doubled over and vomited, the horrific reality crashing over him like a wave. Sd. Bartholomew Seminary wasn't just making people disappear. They were systematically murdering them and destroying the evidence. The transfer documents, resignation letters, and monastery assignments were all elaborate fiction designed to convince the outside world that these men had left voluntarily. As Marcus stumbled back through the basement passages, He could hear increased activity above. Doors were slamming, voices were calling out, and he realized they were searching for him. His investigation had been discovered, and he was about to become the 135th victim of Pennsylvania's oldest seminary. He had to escape, and he had to survive long enough to expose the truth. Marcus emerged from the basement passages through a storage room near the kitchen, his mind reeling from what he'd discovered in the processing chamber. The seminary's morning routine continued normally above him: prayers, breakfast, classes. While below, the evidence of systematic murder lay hidden behind locked doors. He managed to slip back to his dormitory room unnoticed, but his hands were shaking as he attempted to appear normal during breakfast. Timothy sat beside him at their usual table, immediately sensing something was wrong. "Brother Miguel, you look terrible. Are you ill?" "I didn't sleep well," Marcus whispered back, acutely aware that Father Blackwood was watching him from the faculty table. "Timothy, I need to tell you something, but not here. Meet me in the chapel during afternoon study period." The day dragged endlessly. Marcus attended theology classes and participated in work assignments, while his mind raced through escape scenarios. Every corridor seemed to contain potential threats, every priest and faculty member a possible accomplice to mass murder. The weight of 134 lives pressed down on him with crushing force. During the afternoon study period, Timothy met him in the chapel as planned. The sacred space felt different now, less sanctuary, more trap. "Timothy, what I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but you need to listen carefully," Marcus began. "My real name is Marcus Rivera. I'm a journalist investigating the disappearances here. Last night, I found evidence that the men who supposedly transfer to other institutions are actually being murdered." Timothy's face went white. That's insane. This is a seminary, a place of God." "Look at me, Timothy. Do I look like I'm joking?" Marcus grabbed the young man's shoulders. "I found a crematorium in the basement. Personal effects from dozens of missing men. Medical equipment for sedating victims. This entire place is a facade hiding systematic murder. But why? What could they possibly gain from killing seminarians?" Before Marcus could answer, footsteps echoed through the chapel. Father Blackwood approached with two other priests Marcus didn't recognize, large men, who moved with the purposeful stride of security personnel rather than clergy. "Brother Miguel," Blackwood's voice was calm but held an undertone of threat, "would you join me in my office? We have matters to discuss." Marcus felt Timothy tense beside him. "Of course, Father. Should Brother Timothy come as well?" "Brother Timothy will remain here for additional prayer time." "Won't you, Timothy?" The young seminarian nodded quickly, terror evident in his eyes. Blackwood's office occupied a corner of the administrative wing, with windows overlooking the seminary grounds and walls lined with theological texts. But Marcus now noticed details he'd missed during his first visit: deadbolt locks on the inside of the door, windows that couldn't be opened, and what appeared to be soundproofing materials behind the decorative wood paneling. "Please, sit down." "Mr. Rivera," Blackwood said, dropping all pretense. "Yes, I know your real identity. We've known since before you arrived." Marcus remained standing, calculating the distance to the door. "Then why let me in?" "Because your investigation provided valuable intelligence about how much the outside world suspects. Your editor, Sarah Chun, the Philadelphia Police Department, even the FBI. We needed to understand the scope of external interest in our work here." "Your work? You mean murder?" Blackwood walked to his desk and opened a leather-bound journal. "I prefer to think of it as selection and purification. St. Bartholomew. Seminary serves a purpose far greater than training priests. Mr. Rivera, we identify individuals who possess certain qualities: psychological resilience, spiritual depth, intellectual capacity, and we test their worthiness for a higher calling. By torturing and killing them, by subjecting them to increasingly intense spiritual trials. Those who prove worthy are invited to join our inner circle. Those who fail ... double quotes, Blackwood shrugged. Their sacrifice serves the greater good. Marcus felt sick. The inner circle? The true disciples, Mr. Rivera. Men who have transcended conventional morality and embraced the necessity of eliminating weakness from humanity. We operate similar facilities in 7 states, all under the guise of religious institutions. Over the past 30 years, we've processed more than 2,000 candidates. The casual way Blackwood discussed mass murder made Marcus's skin crawl. You're insane. This has nothing to do with religion or spiritual calling, doesn't it? Blackwood's eyes gleamed with fanatical intensity. Every great spiritual movement has required sacrifice. The Crusades, the Inquisition, the purification of heretics. History is written by those willing to do what others consider unthinkable. Marcus backed toward the door. The families, the police, the missing person reports. How do you explain all of that? Carefully forged documentation, bribery of key officials, and when necessary, the elimination of overly persistent investigators. Your colleague Kevin Chun's aunt, for example, suffered a tragic car accident just last week when she threatened to involve federal authorities. Sarah was dead. Marcus felt rage and grief war within him, but forced himself to stay focused on survival. You won't get away with this. Too many people know. Actually, Mr. Rivera, you've helped us identify exactly who knows what. Your infiltration allowed us to monitor communications between you and your editor, trace your investigation methods, and compile a comprehensive list of everyone connected to this inquiry. By tomorrow morning, a gas leak at the Philadelphia Inquirer offices will tragically claim several lives, including the entire investigative team. Marcus lunged for the door, but the 2 large priests were faster. They grabbed his arms and forced him into the chair while Blackwood prepared a syringe from his desk drawer. Don't struggle, Mr. Rivera. The sedative will make the initial phase much more comfortable. You're about to begin the same spiritual journey that brought 134 men before you to their ultimate purpose. As the needle approached his arm, Marcus made one desperate attempt to break free, knowing that once they drugged him, he would join the ashes in the basement processing room. The fate of everyone investigating St. Bartholomew Seminary now rested on his ability to escape the next few minutes alive. The sedative burned as it entered Marcus's bloodstream, but his adrenaline-fueled determination kept him conscious enough to fight. As the 2 priests tried to restrain him, he drove his elbow into the larger man's solar plexus and managed to break free momentarily. Brother Thomas, Brother Vincent, control him. Blackwood shouted, his calm facade cracking as Marcus stumbled toward the window. Marcus grabbed a heavy bronze crucifix from Blackwood's desk and smashed it against the reinforced glass. The window cracked but didn't break completely. Behind him, he could hear the priests recovering and approaching again. There's nowhere to run, Mr. Rivera, Blackwood said, his voice regaining its measured tone. The entire facility is secured. Even if you managed to escape this room, you'd never make it off the grounds alive. The sedative was making Marcus's vision blur and his legs unsteady, but desperation drove him forward. He grabbed the desk lamp and swung it at Brother Thomas, the larger priest, connecting with his temple and dropping him to the floor. Brother Vincent lunged forward, but Marcus was ready. He used the man's momentum against him, stepping aside and sending him crashing into the bookshelf. Theological texts rained down as Vincent collapsed unconscious. Impressive, Mr. Rivera, Blackwood observed, seeming almost entertained by the violence. Perhaps you do possess the qualities we're looking for, after all. Marcus steadied himself against the desk, fighting the sedative's effects. The qualities for what? Your insane cult? The Church of Final Purification isn't insane. Mr. Rivera, we're evolutionists. Humanity is weak, corrupted by sentiment and false morality. We're breeding a new form of spiritual warrior, men who understand that mercy is weakness, and that true service to God requires the elimination of the unworthy. You're serial killers hiding behind religious rhetoric. Blackwood opened his desk drawer and withdrew a pistol. We're visionaries, Mr. Rivera, and you're about to join a very select group of individuals who've been chosen for our most intensive spiritual development program. The office door burst open, and Timothy stumbled, in his face pale with terror. Father Blackwood, I'm sorry, but there are police cars approaching the main gate. Marcus felt a surge of hope, but Blackwood's expression remained calm. How many cars, Brother Timothy? 3, Father. Maybe 4, and I think I saw FBI markings on one of them. Excellent. Right on schedule. Blackwood smiled coldly. Mr. Rivera, it appears your backup plan is proceeding exactly as we anticipated. Marcus's heart sank as he realized the implications. You wanted them to come. Of course. What better way to eliminate an entire investigation team than to lure them to an isolated location where we control every variable? Blackwood walked to his window and peered out at the approaching vehicles. Brother Timothy, please activate the lockdown protocols. Code 7. Timothy hesitated. Father, what does Code 7 mean? It means everyone dies, Timothy, Marcus said, the sedative making his words slur slightly. The police, the FBI, everyone investigating this place. He's going to kill them all. That's impossible, Timothy stammered. Father, tell him that's not true. Blackwood turned from the window with an expression of paternal disappointment. Brother Timothy, your spiritual development has been insufficient. You lack the commitment necessary for our true work. He raised the pistol and shot Timothy in the chest. The young seminarian collapsed with a look of shock and betrayal, blood spreading across his white shirt. Marcus watched in horror as the life faded from Timothy's eyes, another victim of St. Bartholomew's systematic evil. Now then, Mr. Rivera, Blackwood said, turning the gun back toward Marcus. We have approximately 10 minutes to prepare your fellow journalists and law enforcement officers for their final spiritual trial. The basement chambers are quite spacious. They'll accommodate everyone comfortably. Through the office windows, Marcus could see the police cars pulling into the seminary's courtyard. He recognized the lead vehicle as Detective Sarah Chin's unmarked sedan. His editor hadn't died in a gas leak, she'd assembled a rescue team and come for him personally, but she was walking into a trap that Blackwood had been planning from the beginning. Marcus realized that his investigation hadn't exposed the seminary's crimes. It had provided them with the perfect opportunity to eliminate everyone who knew the truth about the 134 disappearances. The sedative was making his thoughts fuzzy, but one thing remained crystal clear. He had to warn Sarah and the others before they entered the building. You won't get away with this, Marcus said, forcing his words to remain steady despite the drugs in his system. Too many people know. The FBI, the state police, federal authorities. Actually, Mr. Rivera, after today's tragic incident, a mentally unstable journalist attacking a peaceful seminary and forcing law enforcement to respond with deadly force, public sympathy will be entirely on our side. The investigation will be closed, the surviving families will be compensated for their loss, and St. Bartholomew Seminary will continue its sacred work undisturbed. Marcus looked down at Timothy's body and felt rage override the sedative's effects. This young man had trusted him, had risked everything to help expose the truth. And now he was dead because Marcus's investigation had been compromised from the very beginning. As footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, Sarah and the rescue team approaching Blackwood's office, Marcus made a decision that would determine whether anyone survived the next hour. He was done being a victim, and he was done letting other people die for his mistakes. The footsteps in the corridor grew louder as Sarah's rescue team approached Blackwood's office. Marcus could hear her voice coordinating with the other officers. unaware they were walking directly into a carefully orchestrated trap. "Father Blackwood." Sarah called through the door. "This is Philadelphia Police Detective Sarah Chen. We need to speak with you about one of your seminarians." Blackwood smiled coldly and positioned himself behind his desk, the pistol hidden but ready. "Of course, Detective. Please come in. I'm always happy to cooperate with law enforcement." Marcus fought against the sedative's effects, knowing he had only seconds to act. As the door opened and Sarah entered with 3 other officers, he summoned every ounce of strength he possessed. "Sarah, it's a trap!" he shouted, throwing himself at Blackwood just as the priest raised his weapon. The gun discharged, the bullets shattering a theological text on the bookshelf as Marcus and Blackwood crashed to the floor. Sarah immediately drew her service weapon. While the other officers spread out to secure the room, "Marcus, what the hell is going on here?" Sarah demanded, keeping her gun trained on Blackwood as Marcus struggled to pin the older man down. "He's been murdering people, Sarah," Marcus gasped, the physical exertion making the sedative's effects worse. 134 victims over 10 years. There's a crematorium in the basement, medical equipment for torture, files on everyone who's disappeared. Blackwood stopped struggling and began laughing, a sound devoid of any human warmth. "Detective Chun, your journalist friend is clearly suffering from a psychological breakdown. We've been trying to help him, but he became violent and attacked our staff." "Where are brothers Thomas and Vincent?" Sarah asked, noting the 2 unconscious priests on the floor. "They were trying to restrain Mr. Rivera when he attacked them with that crucifix," Blackwood said smoothly. "I was forced to sedate him for everyone's safety." One of the FBI agents, a woman Marcus didn't recognize, stepped forward. "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us for questioning. We have reports of multiple missing persons connected to this facility." "Of course," Blackwood said agreeably. "Though I should warn you that Mr. Rivera has been making increasingly disturbed claims about our peaceful seminary. We've been concerned about his mental state since he arrived here under false pretenses." Marcus felt his strength fading as the sedative took full effect, but he forced himself to speak. "Sarah, check the basement. Sub-level 3, behind the locked doors. You'll find everything, the crematorium, the personal effects, the files, documenting every murder." "He's been obsessed with conspiracy theories," Blackwood continued calmly. "Seminary life can be psychologically challenging for some individuals. Perhaps the isolation triggered a break with reality." But Sarah had known Marcus for years, and she could see something in his eyes that convinced her he was telling the truth, despite his drugged condition. "Agent Morrison," she said to the FBI agent, "I want a full search of this facility. Start with the basement." "That won't be necessary," Blackwood said, his pleasant facade finally cracking. "But if you insist on trespassing on sacred ground, I'm afraid you'll discover that St. Bartholomew Seminary has very effective security measures." As if on cue, the lights went out throughout the building. Emergency lighting cast eerie red shadows across the office walls, and Marcus could hear heavy footsteps moving through the corridors beyond. "Code 7, Blackwood whispered, and Marcus realized the true scope of the trap they'd walked into. The seminary's inner circle, the men who had passed Blackwood's twisted trials and become willing accomplices to mass murder, were moving to eliminate the law enforcement team. The building's exits would be sealed, communications jammed, and within hours, the official story would be that a deranged journalist had triggered a deadly confrontation at a peaceful religious institution. "Sarah," Marcus struggled to his feet. "We need to get out of here, now. There are others, trained killers disguised as priests. This whole place is a fortress designed to trap victims." Agent Morrison spoke into her radio, but received only static in response. "Communications are down. Detective Chun, what's your assessment?" Sarah looked at Marcus, then at Blackwood's satisfied expression, and made a decision that would determine whether any of them survived the next hour. We're in hostile territory. Mr. Rivera is telling the truth. This isn't a seminary, it's a killing ground. The office door slammed shut behind them, followed by the distinctive sound of deadbolts engaging. They were locked in with their only exit blocked, while armed accomplices moved through the darkness beyond to eliminate any chance of escape. Blackwood stood slowly, no longer bothering to maintain his religious facade. Welcome to your final spiritual trial. I do hope you're prepared for what comes next. Through the reinforced windows overlooking the courtyard, Marcus could see armed figures moving between their police vehicles, disabling engines and communication equipment. The trap was complete, and 134 victims were about to become many more. But as the sedative finally overwhelmed his system and consciousness began to fade, Marcus realized that Sarah's determination to find the truth had given them one advantage. Blackwood hadn't anticipated she'd brought enough firepower to fight back. The question was whether it would be enough to survive what Pennsylvania's oldest seminary had become. Marcus awakened to the sound of gunfire echoing through St. Bartholomew's Seminary's corridors. His head pounded from the sedative, but consciousness was returning along with the horrifying memory of their situation. Through the red emergency lighting, he could see Sarah and Agent Morrison barricaded behind Blackwood's desk, returning fire through the shattered office door. "Marcus, thank God you're awake," Sarah called without taking her eyes off the corridor. "How many of them are there?" "I don't know," Marcus replied, struggling to clear the drugs from his system. "Blackwood mentioned an inner circle, but I never got an exact count." He looked around the office and realized something was missing. "Where is Blackwood?" Agent Morrison gestured toward the window. "He disappeared when the shooting started. Probably has escape routes we don't know about." The office windows overlooked a seminary courtyard, where Marcus could see at least 6 armed figures systematically destroying their vehicles and communication equipment. The FBI tactical team that had accompanied Sarah's rescue attempt was pinned down behind their armored van, but they were clearly outnumbered. "Sarah, we can't stay here," Marcus said, forcing himself to think clearly despite the sedative's lingering effects. "This office is a trap, reinforced windows, single exit, soundproofed walls. Blackwood designed it to contain victims." A burst of automatic weapons fire splintered the doorframe inches from Agent Morrison's head. "Then what do you suggest?" "We can't fight our way through armed killers with just handguns." Marcus remembered his exploration of the basement and the hidden passages he'd discovered. "There's another way out. The basement has multiple levels and connecting tunnels. If we can reach the kitchen storage area, I can get us to the sub-basement where the evidence is hidden." "Evidence won't help us if we're dead," Sarah said grimly. "It will if we can transmit it to the outside world. The basement has the seminary's main communication equipment, landlines, internet servers, emergency broadcast systems. We can expose everything Blackwood has done here and call for massive backup." Agent Morrison looked skeptical. "Assuming we can survive long enough to reach the basement." Marcus stood up, testing his balance. The sedative was wearing off, replaced by determination fueled by anger over Timothy's murder and the 134 victims who had died in this place. "Sarah, you've known me for 8 years. Have I ever led you into a situation I couldn't get you out of?" "There's a first time for everything," she replied, but he could see the trust in her eyes. "All right, Marcus. How do we do this?" The gunfire in the corridor had momentarily stopped, suggesting their attackers were repositioning or reloading. Marcus moved to Blackwood's desk and began searching through the drawers until he found what he was looking for: a set of master keys and a floor plan showing areas not included in the public building layout. "The seminary has a service corridor system behind the main walls," he explained, spreading the floor plan across the desk. "It was probably installed during renovations to allow maintenance access without disturbing religious services. We can use it to reach the basement without going through the main corridors." Agent Morrison studied the layout. Where's the access point? Behind that bookshelf. Marcus pointed to the wall where Brother Vincent had crashed earlier. I noticed the books were fake, just facades hiding a doorway. Sarah helped him push the heavy bookshelf aside, revealing a narrow service door marked Authorized Personnel Only. Marcus used one of Blackwood's keys to unlock it, and they found themselves in a dimly lit corridor that ran parallel to the main hallways. Stay close and stay quiet, Marcus whispered as they began moving through the service passages. We're heading for the kitchen first, then down to the basement levels where I found the evidence. The service corridors were cramped and filled with pipes, electrical conduits, and ventilation systems. But they allowed the three of them to move through the building without encountering Blackwood's armed accomplices. Through thin walls, they could hear shouts and gunfire as the tactical team outside continued their desperate defense. When they reached the kitchen level, Marcus led them through the storage areas to the basement access he'd used during his midnight investigation. The familiar stone corridors and locked doors took on a different character now, no longer evidence of historical crimes, but potential tools for exposing ongoing atrocities. My God, Agent Morrison breathed as Marcus showed them. The chambers containing medical equipment, personal effects, and files documenting 134 murders. This is worse than anything we imagined. Sarah was photographing everything with her phone, building an evidence file that would be impossible to dismiss or cover up. Marcus, where's the communication equipment? Next level down, he replied, leading them deeper into the seminary's foundations. But Sarah, there's something else you need to see first. The processing chamber with its industrial crematorium hit Agent Morrison like a physical blow. She staggered backward, her professional composure cracking as the full scope of the atrocity became clear. 134 people, she whispered, all of them murdered and cremated to hide the evidence. And it would have continued, Marcus said grimly, if we hadn't exposed it tonight. They found the communication center in a reinforced bunker beneath the processing chamber, clearly designed to coordinate the seminary's activities with similar facilities in other states. Marcus began powering up the equipment while Sarah continued documenting evidence, and Agent Morrison coordinated with the FBI tactical team through a restored radio connection. This is Agent Morrison, she spoke into the radio. We need immediate backup, at least 20 additional agents and a forensics team. We've uncovered evidence of mass murder at this location. As the communication systems came online, Marcus began uploading the evidence files to FBI servers, news organizations, and law enforcement agencies across multiple states. Within minutes, the story of St. Bartholomew's Seminary would be impossible to suppress or cover up, but their triumph was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the corridor above. Father Blackwood's voice echoed through the basement chambers, calm and controlled despite the collapse of his operation. Mr. Rivera, Detective Chen, Agent Morrison, you've accomplished something quite remarkable tonight. You've exposed 30 years of careful work and condemned dozens of dedicated disciples to prison or death. Marcus looked at Sarah and Agent Morrison, realizing Blackwood had found them despite their efforts to remain hidden. The communication center had only one exit, and their enemy was blocking it. But, Blackwood continued, his voice growing closer, you've also ensured that St. Bartholomew's Seminary's final victims will be remembered as heroes rather than statistics. I think there's a certain poetry in that, don't you? The basement lights went out, plunging them into complete darkness as Blackwood's final trial began. But this time, Marcus was ready for him. Epilogue. 3 months later, the morning sun cast long shadows across the Philadelphia skyline as Marcus Rivera sat in his editor's office, reviewing the final proofs of his book manuscript. 134 vanished. The St. Bartholomew Seminary murders would be published next month, ensuring that the victims' stories would never be forgotten. Hard to believe it's only been 3 months, Sarah Chun said, settling into the chair across from his desk. She'd been promoted to chief of detectives following the successful conclusion of the case, but she still made time for their weekly meetings to discuss ongoing investigations. "Sometimes it feels like 3 years," Marcus replied, setting down the manuscript. "Other times, it feels like it happened yesterday." The final confrontation in St. Bartholomew's basement had lasted 4 hours. Blackwood and his remaining accomplices had fought with the desperate fury of cornered animals, but they'd been outnumbered and outgunned by the FBI tactical teams that responded to Agent Morrison's call for backup. When the smoke cleared, 17 members of the inner circle were dead, including Father Augustine Blackwood himself. "Any word on the other facilities?" Sarah asked. "The FBI raided locations in Ohio, West Virginia, Tennessee, Georgia, Florida, and Texas," Marcus reported. "They found evidence of another 400 victims across all 7 sites. The entire network has been shut down, and the survivors are receiving counseling and support. What about the families?" Marcus's expression grew somber. "That's the hardest part. Most of them thought their loved ones had simply chosen religious life and were doing well. Learning the truth has been devastating, but at least they finally have answers." Through the office window, Marcus could see the Pennsylvania countryside stretching toward the horizon. St. Bartholomew Seminary had been demolished 2 months ago, the site consecrated and converted into a memorial garden where families could remember their lost loved ones. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Sarah said quietly. "Timothy. That young man died trying to help you expose the truth. He deserves to be remembered as a hero." "He will be," Marcus assured her. "The book dedicates an entire chapter to his courage. Without his willingness to risk everything, we might never have uncovered the full scope of what was happening there." A knock on the office door interrupted their conversation. Agent Morrison entered, carrying a thick folder of documents. "Marcus." "Sarah, I wanted to update you on the investigation's final phase," she said, taking a seat beside Sarah. "We've identified and contacted the families of all 534 confirmed victims across the 7 facilities. The DOJ is preparing criminal cases against 43 surviving accomplices, and Congress is planning hearings on how such extensive criminal activity went undetected for so long." "What about the money?" Marcus asked. Blackwood mentioned funding from multiple sources. "That's still under investigation, but we've traced financial connections to several wealthy individuals and organizations who believed they were supporting legitimate religious education. Most appear to have been unaware of the murders, though. Some clearly knew and will face charges as accessories." Sarah leaned forward in her chair. "Agent Morrison, off the record, how many other operations like this do you think are still out there?" The FBI agent was quiet for a long moment. "That's what keeps me awake at night, Detective. St. Bartholomew's network operated for 30 years without detection. They were sophisticated, well-funded, and completely ruthless. It's possible there are other similar operations that we haven't discovered yet." Marcus felt a familiar surge of investigative instinct. "If there are others, we'll find them." The story of St. Bartholomew Seminary has generated hundreds of tips from people who've had similar experiences or suspicions about other institutions. "Just promise me you'll be more careful next time," Sarah said with a mixture of concern and affection. "Going undercover in a place like that nearly cost you your life." "It also saved 534 families from wondering forever what happened to their loved ones," Marcus replied. "That's worth the risk." As Agent Morrison left to return to her office, Sarah remained behind for a few more minutes. "Marcus, there's something I need to tell you," she said, her expression becoming serious. "The Bureau has asked me to head up a new task force investigating similar cases across the country. I want you to consider joining as a civilian consultant." Marcus looked out the window again, thinking about Timothy's courage, the 534 victims who would never see another sunrise, and the families who deserved answers about their missing loved ones. "When do we start?" he asked. Sarah smiled, knowing she'd get that answer. Next week. There's a case in Oregon, a retreat center where 12 people have disappeared over the past 2 years. The local authorities think they're dealing with voluntary departures. But the pattern looks familiar. As Marcus gathered his materials and prepared to leave the office, he felt the weight of responsibility that came with his unique experience. He'd survived St. Bartholomew Seminary, exposed its horrors, and brought justice to those responsible. But somewhere else, other predators were exploiting people's faith and trust to commit unthinkable crimes. The story of Pennsylvania's oldest seminary was over. But Marcus Rivera's investigation into America's hidden predators was just beginning. The sun was setting over Philadelphia as he walked home, and in the gathering darkness, he could almost hear Timothy's voice encouraging him to continue seeking the truth, no matter how dangerous or difficult that path might be. 134 people had vanished at St. Bartholomew Seminary, but their memory would live on in the justice their exposure had brought to hundreds of other victims across the country, and in the promise that no one else would disappear without someone fighting to bring them home.